I'd like to introduce many of you to an organization that you may not have heard of before, but you will eventually, the Sanford Health System. That's based right here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and it is a large healthcare facility and a large research facility with whom Texas Instruments has formed a collaborative partnership to develop this new program that we call STEM Behind Health, the first activity of which was released this past weekend at NSTA, the National Science Teachers Association National Conference in Chicago. That was the rollout for that, and you folks are actually the very first people to see this activity on a computer screen, and so we're very excited about that. And so we're going to walk through the very first activity that we developed for the STEM Behind Health program. Toward the end, Mike will go back over some things with you and give you some strategic things, and one of those is talk about online resources that we will discuss on how to get the activities for free. And Mike will also talk about some social media opportunities for you and future webinars.
Thanks, Jeff. And Liz is going to discuss our expected outcomes.
Hi, everybody. So first this evening, we're going to be talking about the STEMBehindHealth.com, and then also going through the type 1 diabetes managing a critical ratio, this first activity that Jeff mentioned, which is an innovative program encouraging students to investigate math and science and look at careers associated with health and healthcare, which we know are very exciting for them, so that we can study disease cause and treatment. And then as we go through this series of activities, eventually also look at potential cures for disease. We'll invite you to stay in touch with social media and upcoming events, and I will place some of the social media hashtags and handles in the chat window as well.
Thanks so much, Liz. It's all yours.
Okay, everybody. Hopefully all of you can see my desktop here. You didn't really want to see my email screen, but here's the desktop that I'd like to show you, and the couple of websites that I would like to show you as we introduce this new program, again called STEM Behind Health, and you can see that right here on this splash page of the website. You can just go to stembehindhealth.com, and this will pop up for you. And this is actually, this website is managed by Texas Instruments. And we have the star of our first activity right here, we'll talk about in just a little bit. And this initial page, we would really encourage you when you go to stembehindhealth.com to go to this lower right-hand corner. This gentleman is the president of the TI Education Technology Division, and just watch the little 1 minute or minute and a half video that Peter Belita is presenting to the world and to introduce this new project that we have undertaken. This is something that TI could not have done on their own without the assistance, and that's maybe too light of a word, without the partnership of Sanford Health. And so Liz is going to talk a little bit about the Sanford webpage and really what Sanford's mission is in the Sanford Research Program. Liz?
Hi, everybody. So the Sanford Research Program is actually part of a project is a nonprofit component of the Sanford Health Enterprise. So as a large healthcare system in the Midwest, we cover a footprint that actually includes South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, Montana, and Minnesota. So a really large footprint there, but the Sanford Research component of that is really charged to do translational biomedical research. And so one of the research departments within our center is the Children's Health Research Department, and these are a group of scientists who are working on children's disease and development. And one of those scientists is actually Dr. Kurt Griffin, who's been our partner with this project, with the Type 1 Diabetes Project. And Jeff's showing you the links to those pages as well so that you can get there.
I think Liz might be having some child issues. So when she comes back on, I'll bring you back over to that Sanford website. Let's just take a look here at back to the TI website and look at this activity a little bit. I kind of think some of this stuff is pretty cool. We got a link to healthcare here, so we have kind of the little tabs that you would have on your file or on your chart that would be at a physician's office or in a hospital. And I'm going to go ahead and click here on where it says see the activity. And when we go to that next page, there is this young lady named Chelsea. And I'll talk a little bit more about Chelsea when we get to the point where we're looking at the actual activity that is can be run on the TI Inspire software or the TI Inspire handheld. But give you a little teaser, Chelsea was a student of mine, I think probably about 5 or 6 years ago. She was a junior in high school in my AP biology class, and it didn't take long for her to boldly state that she was a type 1 diabetic. And you can see on this page she was diagnosed when she was 12 years old. And I'm just going to, as I talk a little bit about Chelsea and about this page, I'm just going to show you a little bit here of what this young lady looks like, and just you can just see without even hearing it what kind of attitude she has and the outlook she has on life. So this little 2.5-minute video is embedded in the TI website. And we have an interview. Most of the video is actually Chelsea being interviewed and telling a little bit about her life and what she has to deal with every day as a type 1 diabetic. Chelsea was a severe type 1 diabetic. She was, when she was diagnosed, almost on the verge of a level of blood sugar where she would have been considered a possibility for a diabetic coma. She was eventually giving herself 9 to 10 insulin shots a day, and so I figured that she would be a perfect person, plus the fact that she's a wonderful young lady, perfect person to use as an example, if you will, and as a role model for young kids who are trying to deal with this disease of type 1 diabetes. So what you see here on the video is just some of the things that we either have or will be including in the activity. That previous gentleman you saw with the bow tie is Dr. Kurt Griffin, and he's the chief researcher for the Diabetes Project at Sanford. So I'll go ahead and close that up, and then we will take a look at a little bit more on this page. I just want to call out a couple things to you. There's a little background information here, but toward the bottom of this page, we have the activity, the type 1 diabetes. We're calling this one managing a critical ratio, and Liz will make reference to the meaning for that critical ratio business here in just a few minutes. But here are the activities that you can download free from this website. There's a zip file that you can download here. Here's the actual TNS file, and I know that many of you are familiar with what that means, but for those who are not, TNS is a TI Inspire file that's specifically designed to play on the TI Inspire software on a computer or on an iPad or on a handheld. We also have with our activities student worksheets, which are Word documents, which are easy to change and modify. We also have teacher notes, so you can go and take a look at how we would suggest you might want to go through these activities. And then at the bottom of this page, it introduces our first activity. There is Dr. Griffin himself, and you can see he is the Director of Clinical Trials, and he is definitely a scientist at the Sanford Project Research Center. And just to let you know what this is all about, Sioux Falls has been blessed with a very, very large and well-stocked and well-manned and woman research facility that is researching all kinds of things, but one of those is type 1 diabetes. And Dr. Griffin is heading up that effort. So I think Liz is back. Are you not, Liz?
Yes, I am, and I apologize for the interruption, we'll call it.
No problem. Like you said in your little chat, real life sometimes gets in the way. So
yeah.
Let's go. Here's that the Children's Health page if you want to make a couple
references. Yeah, so from
there.
Children's Health, if you're interested or your students are interested in projects that are going on today in real life, this translational work, the Sanford Project, and the link is here on the left-hand bar, is the one that we're highlighting in this particular activity. But this is real current science, and so the Sanford Project is actually working towards understanding underlying causes of type 1 diabetes. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the activity because it addresses some of that content with students. But this is real relevant current research that's happening today out of South Dakota, but really it's a global project, and we've got partners all around the planet. As you may know, with every aspect of science, you really have to involve a lot of partnerships. But as we continue to go through these, we also wanted to really be sure that students were aware of the variety of careers that existed. So we've got physicians, who you see a lot on this list that Jeff is showing you, but we have then the PhD scientists as well as part of our many departments, and then all of the people that really help make research work, so our research assistants and the nurses and the radiologists and all of the people that exist within a research network that allows for things to move forward and innovation to take place. So if you're interested in more information on that, the SanfordResearch.org site is really helpful, but STEM Behind Health, we're going to be bringing in a lot of that into those TI projects as we continue to collaborate together down the road.
Excellent. And I just want to also make mention of just a couple of sort of structural things that have made this partnership possible, and maybe a little bit of the reasoning behind this. Having done some, as Mike mentioned in the introductions, I've been doing PD and teacher trainings and that kind of thing for TI for almost 20 years. And TI Inspire really does provide a way for teachers to put content in front of students, not just do calculations on a graphing calculator, but we can also put content, run simulations, and so on. So when I started the full-time gig with Texas Instruments, I thought, man, we have this terrific research facility right here in our little town of Sioux Falls, who's doing some amazing things with some amazing goals, and to combine the two forces of TI's technology and Sanford's research expertise into some really, really cutting-edge research and also some cutting-edge content. That's how this whole partnership was formed. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at this activity that we have called Managing a Critical Ratio. And right on the first page of this activity, you can see we have the Sanford Health logo, which we want to make sure we call out as much as we can, because the work they're doing is terrific, and the work they will be doing is terrific. And this is Chelsea. This is a young lady around whom this activity has been designed. We start out on all of our activities with sneaking in a little bit of reading for our students who are going to be using this. This is a very little bit of reading on this page, but we just want them to meet Chelsea. We really feel that if we include the story, that people, especially the young people, are going to be engaged with it. And Chelsea is a very engaging young lady, and she's a normal kid who just happens to have type 1 diabetes. So we want kids to feel like they have some kind of a connection with this young lady. Then on this page, this is Chelsea when she went to the hospital when she was 12 years old, and I'll come back to a little bit more about this in a few minutes. Just talk a little bit about Chelsea's, her journey as she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes until she was finally able to be managed fairly well. And Liz will mention this as well, but this type 1 diabetes, just for those of you who are not familiar, is, as you can imagine, there's a type 2 diabetes as well. Type 1 diabetes is the type that someone really can, it's not a lifestyle that causes this. This is typically an autoimmune disease where there's certain parts of the pancreas that are under attack by your own immune system, and you really are helpless to prevent it. So in future activities, perhaps we'll call out type 2 diabetes a little bit more. But anyway, here is little Chelsea with, as a 12-year-old. I believe she was in 6th grade at the time when she was diagnosed. Liz, will you want to take us through this a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, you know, for a lot of us, as we go through and learn about type 1 diabetes, and I know for myself, really understanding the complexity of the disease and understanding all of the content that goes into it. As a former middle school science teacher, or a lot of the work that I do with current biology teachers and math teachers and everyone, it's really exciting to be able to bring in so many aspects of content in such an introductory way that you could really take a lot of this and go into a lot of different directions. So really clarifying for students that type 1 diabetes isn't something that you can get from someone else. It's not actually something that we have a direct genetic link for. We know there's some genetics associated and there's some changes in prevalence, but it's really an autoimmune disorder where these patients, their body is actually attacking itself, and it's attacking a specific portion of their body, these beta cells inside of the pancreas. And it's the job of these cells to produce insulin. So insulin is a hormone. This allows you to introduce concepts about endocrinology and how hormones and chemical signals work. And its job really is to open up channels in the cell. And so when insulin combines with a receptor on the outside of a cell, it allows this channel to open up that allows us to take in glucose. And so we talk a lot about blood sugar, and in the activity we're going to introduce some concepts about blood sugar, but really we're talking about this insulin producing issue. So a type 1 diabetic, in contrast to type 2, is not producing insulin, whereas a type 2 diabetic is sometimes having a hard time responding to the insulin that they do produce. So we will highlight in one of the next slides as well a little bit of that information about the cells and the energy that's associated with that. But I'm going to actually let Jeff tell you a little story about Miss Chelsea and when she first went to the hospital.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, Chelsea was 12 when she was diagnosed, and her diagnosis came under some pretty stressful situation. She was actually staying with her grandmother. Her parents were on vacation. I believe they're in Mexico. And her grandmother got alarmed because Chelsea downed an entire pitcher of Kool-Aid in about 10 minutes. And after she downed that pitcher of Kool-Aid, she asked her grandma if she could have some more. She was just really, really thirsty. And then, grandma had the wherewithal to say, well, this doesn't really seem normal. This 12-year-old kid just drank a half a gallon of Kool-Aid in 10 minutes, and she still wants more. And so one thing led to another, and she said, well, I think we probably ought to go have somebody check you out. And so they took her to the emergency room at Sanford Hospital. We have a Sanford Hospital right here in Sioux Falls, in addition to several clinics and the research facility. So they went to the emergency room at Sanford Hospital, and after she had her blood tested, her blood glucose level, as you can see here, was 874. Now, when you wake up in the morning, if you are not a diabetic, your blood sugar is probably about 80. Or after you've eaten a meal, after your body kicks in with the insulin, your blood sugar might be 100 to 120. So normally, blood sugar, as you can see up here, would not go above 140, and that the units here are milligrams per deciliter of blood. Now, just to give you an idea, as you can see, this is crazy high. She's bordering on or coming up toward 900, and there was, once you get to that level, you're really kind of walking a tightrope as far as having some really nasty stuff health-wise happen to you. And so essentially, the grandma saved her life. And we like to call out that Sanford Health saved her life, because not only was Chelsea diagnosed at Sanford, the endocrinologist that she had that eventually took care of her as far as monitoring her blood glucose and her insulin levels, and who eventually fit her with an insulin pump, is also a Sanford physician. So Chelsea feels a tremendous debt of gratitude to Sanford, as do her parents, who were helpless because they were not even home at the time. So this is a very critical situation for this young lady, who all of a sudden was pretty much overtaken by this crazy thirst and then this crazy need to urinate, and grandma had the wherewithal to get her to the hospital and get this diagnosed for her. And this is a young lady, too, that when I had her in class, she was a junior in high school, so this would have been about 5 years after she was diagnosed. by that point had a pump and was very, very well in tune with her body. And we had several conversations. I learned so much from Chelsea on what type 1 diabetes is, how people manage it, how she feels when her blood sugar is very low, how she feels when her blood sugar is very high, and so on. So that's just a kind of the Reader's Digest version of the story about how Chelsea was diagnosed, and then how she's dealt with it afterwards is what we're going to be taking a look at now. So let's take a look at a simulation. This is one of the beautiful things about TI Inspire, and again, I realize that many of you are current TI Inspire users, so this will be something that is very familiar to you. But what we have behind this set of directions, which, by the way, don't expect kids to read them, and unless your kids are different from the students I had, they may not take a look at this. But this is actually really important. So we have to actually, we're going to use this device, a simulated device called a glucometer, a glucose test meter, a blood test meter, and we're going to check Chelsea's blood sugar at different points of the day if she did not have insulin. So let me go ahead and close that up, and Liz is going to walk us through this little simulation. But notice what the heading says. This is blood glucose without insulin, and here's our beautiful young lady, Chelsea, all happy. She's just getting up at 9 a.m. So Liz, you ready to do this?
Yeah, so we'll go through it. We're going to actually test Chelsea's blood glucose. I think this is really fun to do with students. You know, if I had you here, I'd definitely find out how many of you have ever had to do this before. It's one of the things that for me to pull that little trigger and actually prick my own finger for some reason is just a psychological barrier for me. But the glucose meter or glucometer on the left-hand side of the screen, we're actually going to be able to utilize that. So Jeff's going to move his arrow into the power button there, and we're going to turn on the device. We'd insert a strip, and then we're actually going to be able to take Chelsea's blood glucose when she first wakes up in the morning. So you can see her little finger jump in there, and we take up a little droplet of blood, and we find out that she's at 80 milligrams per deciliter, which if you've been following the chat, and I'm doing my best to keep up with that, but nice chat comments, everybody. I might have to go back and look at some of those as we go. Seeing when she wakes up, she's feeling really good. If you saw John's comment in the chat, that 80 milligrams per deciliter is a really happy place for us to be. So then we're going to actually change the time of day. So the up arrow is going to allow us to change to the 7 o'clock time where she's eaten some breakfast and tested her blood sugar again. And we'll find out a little bit about how she's feeling. You can maybe already see by her face that she's not super impressed. So her blood sugar after eating breakfast has already gone up to 280 milligrams per deciliter. She's thirsty, she's frequently urinating. So, you know, when you're thirsty, maybe you're drinking a lot more water, you might have to go to the bathroom a lot. We're going to lose some blood sugar due to that, but let's go ahead and check another time. Again, remember, this is a single day for a type 1 diabetic without insulin. And I will tell you, for some diabetics, if you're a type 1 diabetic out there, we actually had to kind of level this in such a way that we were saying, okay, what's the low range of likelihood? This could actually spiral out of control even faster, I've been told. So after her 9 o'clock snack, she's nauseous, she's got a headache, her blood sugar is really high up at that 480 milligrams per deciliter. She probably should be thinking about making sure she contacts a health professional at this point. When we go to lunch.
Okay, Liz, let me just interrupt you for just a second. This was Liz's suggestion. It was a great one, that we show on this left side, each page of a TI Inspire document basically is like a PowerPoint slide. And what you see here, if you're looking at the handheld, like you had just a graphing calculator or an iPad in front of you, and you're doing all of this manipulation with eating, testing the sugar, eating, testing the sugar, you wouldn't see this because it was on the next page. This is what I'm circling with the cursor over here. As we're testing Chelsea's blood sugar, her levels are being graphed on the next page, which is page 1.8. You can see we're on 1.7 on the page that follows it. So this is something that is sort of a behind-the-scenes thing that's happening, but I wanted to make sure, and Liz wanted to make sure, it was a great suggestion that you'd be able to see both of these things happening at the same time. So let me just go ahead and there's lunch, and I want to throw in one more thing, Liz. Getting Chelsea to look angry was probably the hardest part of this activity when we're taking pictures of her, because she's not ever angry. She's just always this happy girl, and even here she just kind of looks, she doesn't look sick, she just looks ticked off, sort of. So let's go ahead and test that and see where we're at. Thanks, Liz, for letting me interject that.
Yeah, for sure. And you can, what's so great about the graph, right, too, is that it one, makes a graph really relevant, but two, for me, if I was to ask you again, hey, what was her blood sugar at 7 after breakfast, like, those are just really hard for me to jump around throughout the day and remember what it was from time to time. And this is actually a practice that you might even have a young kid doing with their diabetes, is looking at these kind of graphic representations of what it looks like throughout the day. So after lunch, she's really getting sick, vomiting, no appetite, really not looking so well. I'll second Jeff's comment that telling Chelsea, what does it look like when you have low blood sugar, high blood sugar? She's like, I don't know. So she skips snack because she's not even hungry at that point, and we can test her blood sugar again there. And if you follow the graph, you could kind of see just a second ahead of that, we were at a 560 milligrams per deciliter, so it went down just a little bit. And if you brainstorm in your head, or we're doing this with students, and allow yourself to think about what that might actually be a result of, she's drinking a lot and going to the bathroom a lot, so that blood sugar is there, but she might lose a little. We go back up to that dinner time. And yes, Peggy, it does ride super quick. And she skips her dinner, still has a really high blood sugar, and I'm going to have Jeff click onto this next graph. So we see here it says medical attention is needed, and there's a real reason for that. Remember, we said that it wasn't necessarily about the actual blood sugar level, so whether she's 800 or 400 or 300, if she's above that 150 range for a long period of time, that's telling us that there's a problem. That's telling us that her cells are not taking that sugar in, and that means that her cells are starving. Starving cells are not happy cells, and starving cells are maybe going to be dead cells. And so what we want to do then is make sure that she has something to get that into her body. So it's really about the length of time without sugar for her cells a lot more than it is the actual glucose levels.
Excellent.
And I think this is kind of an aha moment for a lot of people who maybe don't understand type 1 diabetes. For me, just months ago, it was an aha moment, and I've been teaching about diabetes, so there were some things there that made me think about.
Mm-hmm. The next page or two, this is page 1.9, and again, for those of you who are experienced with Inspire, you know that this is sort of the genre that we use, or the strategy we use. We embed questions throughout the activity, and Liz is going to call out some of these questions specifically here in a little bit, but this allows the teacher, to be you, to have the kids, as they encounter one of these questions during the activity, they're asked to answer this, and so they have to answer the question. They can just do that by clicking on one of the bubbles and marking it the way they believe it should be marked. And then after the activity is completed, the teacher can pull this back using TI Navigator, and then the Navigator system will grade these, so to speak, and actually give the teacher a grade for these questions. So that's a beautiful thing, and they can basically use it as formative assessment questions along the way, as students are double-checking to make sure they understand what's going on in the activity. And Liz is going to address this about the blood sugar, because I think if you ask people what's the problem with diabetes, I think somewhere in their explanation will be the word sugar, like, well, they can't have sugar, or if they eat sugar, they're going to get sick, or whatever. Great opportunity for a teacher to say, now let's think about that a little bit. If they ate sugar and got sick and never ate anything that was carbohydrate, that would be a bad deal for them. So, Liz, why don't you explain this slide a little bit?
Yeah, so this was one of those pieces that really connecting, and the chat has kind of led to this as well, that concept about the cells are the problem, right? So insulin is just the opening, the key that opens the door that allows the blood sugar to go into the cells. And to me, one of the things, having a student understand what respiration actually is, the reason why we breathe is so that we can break down the sugar, right? So we need sugar so that our cells can make ATP, so that they can make the energy that they need. So that would allow you to introduce mitochondria and respiration and all those concepts, but just going back to that basic concept of it's the cell that needs the energy. If they don't have sugar, they don't have energy, and the cell will die off. And so when we have that high blood sugar, the hyperglycemia, that's indicating to us that the cells aren't taking in that sugar. Now, of course, if you had someone just consuming massive amounts of sugar, they might be able to get their blood glucose to that level, but we actually make really high amounts of insulin to tell our cells to take all of that up pretty quickly as well.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and Leslie, I really appreciate your question in the chat, and what I'm going to do is actually wait until later on in the activity when we introduce the hypoglycemia content.
Excellent. And I actually made my students a junkie for vocabulary and for taking a look at big words that might look crazy intimidating and getting them to not freak out about it, just taking them apart a little bit. So hyper, you guys all do this as well, but like hyperactivity and that type of thing is too much. That's overproduction or too much of something. And then I'd point out that glycemia, G-L-Y-C, looks an awful lot like G-L-U-C, and glyco actually means sugar, and gluco is actually just a modification of that glyco. So too much sugar is hyperglycemia, which is foreshadowing a little bit what Liz was just talking about with hypoglycemia. So, and then following that, we have some pretty basic questions, or we have one basic question for sure here, and another one where the kids are asked to answer that. And on the next pages, we actually have a written interview that we've had with Chelsea. And by this time, we found that kids are really engaged with this activity. They want to find out, well, we certainly don't want Chelsea to be sick with a blood sugar or a blood glucose level of 580. So how does she deal with this every single day? And so we're not going to spend much time on this, but notice also on Inspire we can color code things, which is really, really a cool thing, and kids really seem to like that. So this talks about, how type 1 diabetes changed her. And, if you talk to Chelsea, if you were on the phone with us right now, she'd say, it didn't change me. It just forced me to do one thing extra in my life, and that is to make sure I had enough insulin. We really want to call out these career opportunities that that the STEM Behind Health program is going to make kids aware of. I want to just briefly talk about Chelsea's career choice. I mentioned to you that she was diagnosed and treated and continues to be treated at Sanford. She is currently finishing up her clinical rotations at Sanford Health, and her goal is to be a pediatric endocrinologist and work with young kids who are diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And I just get goosebumps thinking about it, because here you have a young lady that can't just say, I know how you feel, and really doesn't. She's going to say to these kids, I know how you feel, and she does know how they feel. And she's able to relate to them 100%. And so we're really hopeful that Chelsea will be able to land a job at Sanford. Liz, I'm not sure if you can do anything about that, but having her being a pediatric endocrinologist at Sanford would just be, talk about a storybook. I mean, what a beautiful story this would be. So here we got some more questions that we're going to just kind of buzz through real quick here. For those of you who are math teachers, this next part of the show, we bring in some things that are definitely part of the Common Core, definitely part of any good math curriculum in this business about ratios and proportions. And that's basically how Chelsea stays alive every day, is by a ratio that we're going to take a look at here momentarily. So we have a lot of text here that people can read about with Chelsea. Okay, now we're on our next simulation. The first one, remember, was Chelsea's got no insulin. She wakes up, she has a little something to eat, and after just a few hours, she is in a world of hurt because her pancreas, her beta cells, do not produce any insulin. So on this, and I will,
on the slide just prior to this, Chelsea actually introduces it by saying that she has this thing that she has to worry about, this insulin to carbohydrate ratio. And she's actually asked your students then, can you figure out what my insulin to carbohydrate ratio is, which is different for every person with type 1 diabetes. And so a couple of the people in the chat were alluding to this idea of how the different person affects kind of your blood sugar and your insulin levels, and that's what she's starting to introduce here. For every amount of carbohydrate you eat, we're really trying to figure out then what's the appropriate amount of insulin to give you as a dose. And so this next simulation that Jeff's going to walk us through or work through with us is going to allow us to really see for Chelsea as an individual, her age, her activity level, and her personally, what's going to be the best insulin to carbohydrate ratio.
And on the web page itself, Chelsea actually, on her little admission bracelet that is just sitting there on the web page, I don't know if you saw that or not, but it said something like, for me, my life depends on a ratio. My whole life is one big math problem. And so she has to be constantly thinking about her numbers for her insulin and her numbers for carbohydrate. Okay, now here we have another variable that we've introduced. We've introduced this insulin to carbohydrate ratio. So the idea here is to figure out what is Chelsea's ideal average best ratio for insulin to carbohydrate. So we're going to run through these. I'll just kind of do some quick clicking here, but there's our 80 milligrams per deciliter. Now we're starting out with a ratio of 1 to 10, 1 insulin for every 10 carbohydrate. So let's bump her up here. After breakfast, we're going to check, and you can see the graph being generated on the next page. And since you already have an idea of how this works, I just think that's so cool. The blood appears on the finger, and then it gets just kind of sucked right into the glucometer. That's pretty neat.
And if you're watching that graph, you're seeing that it's going up and it's continuing to go up. If you remember the pattern, and somebody commented even in the chat about it, the pattern of her with no insulin, it went straight up there, and it was crazy how fast it rose, right? And so now it's going to go at a much more steady level, but it's still increasing. So by the end of the day, she's not feeling well, impaired thinking. We're just not getting enough of that sugar into her cells. So you can kind of make the guess then of should she have more or less. If your students are going through this and they're not clicking to the next slide to see the graph, then this might be an opportunity for them to do so, or they can actually change now that insulin to carbohydrate ratio, and I'll have Jeff maybe select the 1 to 15. So if you go down to the so this would mean that for the same amount of carbohydrates, she's actually having to take less insulin. So if he goes through and actually checks her blood sugar first thing in the morning, again, we're starting out at that 80 milligrams per deciliter, and then continues to change it to breakfast, goes up, and up, and you can again see the symptoms that exist as she goes through this process. But if you're watching symptomatically or the numbers, or if you're able to see that on the graph, it's going up a lot faster to those really high levels. And so this is indicating to us that she's getting even less sugar into her cells because she's having less insulin. So for 15 grams of carbohydrates, she's taking 1 unit of insulin versus the 1 to 10 where she was having a unit for every 10 grams of carbohydrate. So now if we change that value to the 1 to 5,
you guys remember, where did all three ratios start? When Chelsea woke up in the morning, I believe they all start at 80. So we're starting in the same spot and the same blood sugar level at the beginning of the day.
So it went up after breakfast, which we'd expect any of ours would go up after we ate, and then we should see it kind of go back down. If we eat some more, it's going to go up. Yeah, I'm going to actually take this second, Jeff, if you don't mind, to answer Leslie's question out loud. So trial and error to get the blood glucose correct. Yeah, my best understanding, and I've been working a lot with Dr. Griffin to understand this because he sees patients in his role who are type 1 diabetics and has been doing this for decades. And so a lot of the work still is trial and error, and one of the I mean, to an extent, so they can make approximations based on a kid's age and weight and activity level, but there's still going to be a certain level of time period that goes by where they're going to have to try and figure it out. as they get that good, they're going to be good for a while, but, you know, when you go through things like puberty, or if you have a drastic change in your activity levels, like you start a sport, that may actually change some of your insulin sensitivity factor, which then is going to change your ratios. And so these ratios aren't permanent for the entire lifetime of a person either. And so it's a constant math problem that they have to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to answer Jeff's question here in just a second, or Jeffrey's question here in just a second as well, when we start talking about insulin pumps and actually giving a patient insulin. So on the graph, Jeff, which one's best?
Well, I would say, and this is where the discussion would be, I think, really pretty rich. I would say, well, we're looking for the one that had her insulin levels stabilized the best throughout the day. And I think, you know, you're all adults, and so you can see this level would be the best insulin to carbohydrate ratio, and you can see color-coded over here. This is a level of 1 to 5. So the little orange squares, which are data markers as orange squares, are 1 to 10. The circles are 1 to 15. And Liz is going to address this real quickly, but some of you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. 5 is less than 10, 10 is less than 15, so how does this equate when you're doing a ratio? But anyway, you look at this and the kid can say, we tried this out on some people last weekend, and they're like, oh, so her best ratio is 1 to 5.
So we're monitoring her blood sugar, right? We're telling her cells to continually take up the right amount. And so on this question 5 here on our 2.4 screen, it's asking which is the most appropriate for each meal. And, you know, students can see that that graph is horizontal. That's really doing the monitoring properly of the blood glucose level, indicating that she's taking up the right amount of sugar. Remember, she ate the same amount of sugar on all 3 graph components. This is letting us know that she's also taking up all of that sugar into her cells, or the appropriate amount of that sugar into her cells. As we go through her insulin to carbohydrate ratio, though, that 1 to 5 means she's taking 1 unit per 5 grams of glucose. And so if we take, I'm going to do the easy math problem for me, for my own sake. So 1 to 5, 1 to 10, 1 to 15, a common denominator glucose amount might be 60 grams. And I've been paying attention to this recently, and I laugh at how many times I've been eating meals that have more than 60 grams of sugar, and it makes me just a little bit surprised. But 1 to 5, so we're looking at dividing 60 by 5, and so this would be 12 units of insulin. So she's taking 12 versus a 1 to 10, she's taking 6, and a 1 to 15, she's taking 4. And so she's taking about 3 times as much insulin at the 1 to 5 level as the 1 to 15. So even though the ratio seems like a bigger number, it's implying that she's taking that much insulin for that many grams of glucose. And we'll go through a couple of these. So one of the things that we really like to present, and really engaging the T and the E in the STEM, right? So STEM is transdisciplinary. I'm super excited to see somebody's comment about math and science and technology all together, right? So it's more than just those different parts. It really is truly all of these things interacting together in real life. And so Chelsea actually has an insulin pump that she has to utilize so that she doesn't have to take the injections of insulin multiple times a day. She's quoted as saying that she was at the point of taking 9 and 10 shots a day to be able to give herself insulin. So the insulin pump allows us to deliver insulin straight to her. She still has to fill the pump with the insulin, but this just gives some of that historical perspective to the insulin pump. It was a backpack to start with in the 60s, and then in 1976, Mr. Dean Kamen, the same gentleman who invented the Segway, actually made it into a smaller wearable unit. Now they're getting increasingly smaller, and there's lots of new technology out there if you want to send your students on an amazing web quest. Just on Twitter the other day, the Diabetes Association posted the 17 new innovations in diabetes, and it was type 1 and type 2, but there were incredible new technologies coming out.
Liz, let me just make a quick mention about this as far as Chelsea is concerned specifically. Chelsea was and this story is actually on the website when you take a look at it, but Chelsea was a dancer even after she was diagnosed, and she really didn't cut down her activity level all that much after she was diagnosed. and she was a cheerleader. We have it's called NBA D-League team here in Sioux Falls. They're actually the Miami Heat minor league team, essentially. And Chelsea was a dancer for that minor league team. And as you can, picture some of the cheerleaders you've seen for pro or semi-pro teams, she had part of her abdomen was showing, and she had the insulin pump has a little sticker thing or sticky thing that goes onto her skin through which it administers the insulin. And she came under attack by her teammates, by fans, because they said, well, why are you wearing your nicotine patch visible like that? Or it's pretty rude that you're wearing your birth control patch for everybody to see. And Chelsea, and only Chelsea's way of dealing with things, just kind of smiled and explained to them that no, basically this is keeping her alive, and it was an insulin thing. But she's had to endure quite a bit of not only scrutiny but cruelty from. And I asked her, who's more cruel, kids or adults? And she said, no question. The adults that she's run into who are just uninformed have been much more difficult for her than her classmates. So, I mean, we try to engage the kids with the story of a real person who has had to endure some fairly difficult situations in her quest to manage her diabetes. So Liz, you wanted to talk about, here's our hypo again.
Yeah, somebody asked about hypoglycemia. So I'm actually realizing that I was responding to some questions just straight to Stacy and not to the whole group, so I'm going to try to fix that. Ooh, Liz's first time on the webinar. So hypoglycemia is when we get too low of blood sugar. So if Chelsea actually gave herself too much insulin, then she could end up in a potentially dangerous situation where she ended up with too low of a blood sugar. And this can happen to people as well who are going to drop below that 80 milligrams per deciliter line. And so that would just mean there's not enough sugar floating around in your body, so then your cells are going to starve from sugar, the same result, but it's for a different reason. So in this case, there isn't sugar in the blood for your cells to take up. And so what we ask the students to do is kind of a little bit of critical thinking. If eating food and eating carbohydrates is what's creating the high blood sugar, what would happen if you ended up in a hypoglycemic situation is what we ask them in the next question. And you can think to yourself which of these are really saying, let's get there right away. I want to get sugar straight there right away. And so one of the questions, and I'm just going to address it to everybody, was about the carbohydrate versus the sugar and glucose. So a gram of carbohydrate is how we determine the insulin amount. That's what we would consume, and like on your cereal box it says carbohydrates. The glucose is the simplest form, so once we've digested it, that's that simplest form of the sugar. So that's what we measure in the blood. So here, in order to get really quick, effective, like dive into your bloodstream sugar, that candy or juice is going to be the best way, even a little bit of pop, to really get it in there. I remember having insulin in my desk when I was in the classroom. So I hope that answers the question that somebody was looking at there.
And in a practical way, I mean, if you don't eat, I mean, if you, some of you may have done some fasting, or you just forget to eat, or you get really hungry, you can kind of remember how you feel. I mean, you just feel tired, you just kind of feel spacey and that kind of thing because your cells aren't getting the fuel that they need. And a practical application of this is if you give blood, if you donate blood, and they take 500 milliliters of blood out of you, and you're in a bloodmobile or in a clinic somewhere, before you leave, they usually have you eat something, and this would be a good thing to ask kids, what do you think they have you eat or drink? And they have really high sugar juices, like orange juice, which has a lot of sugar in it, or they'll have granola bars or something with an awful lot of carbohydrate to try to get your blood sugar up a little bit so that you don't feel shaky and have some strange symptoms, which really are the symptoms that Chelsea is in danger of having every single day of her life, not just when she gives blood. So Liz, you wanted to talk about this question, I believe. This question 10 on page 2.12.
Oh yes, so this goes back to the IC ratio again. This to me is probably the area in math And then, of course, this is the appropriate science context, but this is really the area of the math that gets kind of tricky. So answering this question, I think, will really be one of those formative assessment ways to see if students are getting that concept of the units of insulin and grams of carbohydrate and what a ratio is meaning in this case. So Chelsea's ratio we determined was 1 to 5, right? So if she gives herself a dose at 1 to 25, again, I'm going to make math easy for myself. So let's say she ate 50 grams of carbohydrate. A 1 in 5, she'd be taking 12 units of insulin. A 1 in 25, she'd only be having 2 units of insulin. So that would mean she's not taking nearly as much insulin as she needs. She's going to have too much blood sugar. So yeah, she'd be the hyperglycemic. Just to address for everyone as well, the unit is something that it's a little bit complicated, so we didn't really dive into it a whole lot here, but I may actually bring up that we should, thank you, Melinda, put some of that context in the teacher document. So there are different units, there are different concentrations of insulin depending on the manufacturer and the source, and so that can affect what a unit actually means for different types of diabetics. And so some may have to take higher concentrated insulin so that they don't have to take as many units of the lower concentrated dosage. And so that sometimes can affect people's number. And this is why if you just go out and ask a type 1 diabetic, what's your units, it's not necessarily going to equate exactly 1-to-1 from one person to another.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to see more questions if you have those.
As a biology teacher, I know there's some of you online right now who are in Project Lead the Way. You might be in medical interventions or something within Project Lead the Way, or even if you teach AP biology. One of the really great extensions is, where does the insulin come from that Chelsea's putting into her body, or that any diabetic puts into their body? And that's a fabulously rich area where you start talking about using restriction enzymes and using, I know that's for some of you that may not be familiar, but basically you just use bacteria to make human insulin by just reprogramming their DNA and making insulin. Back in the old days, they used to get insulin out of the pancreases of animals that were slaughtered for food, like pigs, and that doesn't happen as much anymore. I'm not sure it happens at all. But anyway, that's potentially a pretty cool extension that you could take off with on this. Liz, I think we're going to probably have to, there's just a couple more questions here. Yeah, these are just kind of extension questions.
It lets them consider over a typical day how many units she's taking, and this just maybe would make a student more aware of if maybe a classmate or a colleague or friend has type 1 diabetes or is having to deal with insulin and carbohydrates, that this is a real life problem and this is something they have to think about all day, every day.
Mm-hmm. So Mike, we got about 5 minutes to go, and I think if it's okay with you, I'm going to turn over control of your desktop so you can get things wrapped up here if you'd like to. So I'll go ahead and send that back over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Jeff. I know we do have some questions that are still floating out there in the chat window, or some questions that may still come in these last couple minutes. So if you do have any last-minute questions, please do try and get those asked. I know Jeff and Liz will do their best to try and get those answered. Since we do have a few people that are probably new to TI Inspire tonight, I'd like to share some resources that are available for you on our website. So our website is education.ti.com. I know earlier, I think at the very beginning, I posted a link for the STEM Behind Health landing page. You can also get it on our website, education.ti.com. On the right-hand side, there's a STEM Behind Health right there. Just want to make note of that. And that, again, will lead you to the activity and everything else that Liz and Jeff were discussing tonight. As far as getting to know a little more about TI Inspire, if you hover under the Professional Development tab and scroll down to Online Learning, there's some good information here about webinars that are upcoming and ones that have already occurred in the past, the on-demand. And there's also these technology tutorials. So that's what I'm going to take a look at. Whenever you click on Technology Tutorials, it brings up a tab that lets you look at some TI Inspire tutorials. And our friends over at Atomic Learning have done a great job writing some really short but effective videos. So whether you're new to TI Inspire or you're a seasoned user and you forget how to do something because it's been a while since you've maybe used a template in Notes. Well, you can say, hey, using templates and Notes, and there's a short 5-minute video. So again, this is all free, and I just wanted to share that with you because, again, if you're new to TI Inspire or just need to brush up on a couple tools and tricks, this is a great place to do it. As I mentioned a minute ago, we do have some upcoming webinars. One that may be of significance to many of you joining us tonight is April 7th. We do have another STEM investigation with TI Inspire Technology webinar coming up. Again, all the upcoming webinars are free, and you can feel free to register for those at any time. Earlier, Liz mentioned that there was some social media that you can stay connected with, and I think we mentioned the hashtag that we're using for this is going to be hashtag STEMBehindHealth, and so you can feel free to use that hashtag to continue the conversation tonight. To get a certificate of attendance, click that link in the chat window. The link contains the name of tonight's event. Also listed is a link for the documents that were used tonight. So the T1D or type 1 diabetes TNS file and activity are listed there as well. If you happen to miss those, have no fear. In a couple of days, you'll automatically get a follow-up email that'll have a link to the recording, a link to the certificate, and a link to the documents as well. Some of you may not have gotten all your questions answered tonight, and we had some really great discussions in the chat window. And I hope that Liz and Jeff did the best they could to try and get those questions answered. But if you do have some additional questions, you might want to contact support with Texas Instruments, and that's ti-cares@ti.com. Also, if you're looking for more information about possibly making some purchases, you can jot down the ti-educators@ti.com email address, and they'll also be able to provide you some follow-up. So a huge thank you goes out to Liz and Jeff tonight. I learned a few things about type 1 diabetes that I didn't know, and so that's always exciting for me. So Liz and Jeff, thank you so much for all the time that you put into preparing for tonight's webinar.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everybody for joining us.
I had an excellent time, and I really look forward to some of the feedback. So as people go through the activity with students, or if you're sharing it with your friends and family who are type 1 diabetics, I'd love to have some of that feedback, and also any of the questions. A couple of these will be really useful for those teacher documents, but it's really nice to make sure that we are able to answer a lot of those teacher and student questions as we go through. And one of the things I've really loved about this collaboration is everything is editable as we go. And so if you've got some excellent ideas, I think this is a really great way to be able to benefit everybody by sharing them. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Liz. And again, thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you back online next week. Have a great night.